The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of First National Bank, but for 73-year-old Grace Washington, each step felt heavier than the last. Her weathered hands gripped the worn leather handle of her cane, the same one her late husband had carved for her 30 years ago. She paused at the entrance, adjusting the collar of her navy blue dress, her Sunday best, because she understood something that younger generations often forgot. When you lived through decades where your very presence was questioned, appearances become armor. Grace had risen before dawn, as she had every day for the past 50 years. First as a hospital cleaner, then as a seamstress, and finally as a caretaker for elderly neighbors who had nowhere else to turn. Every dollar she'd ever earned had been stretched, counted, and carefully saved. Her account at First National held the sum of a lifetime, not millions, but enough to maintain her dignity in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. Today, she simply needed to withdraw enough for her monthly medications and groceries, a routine transaction that should have taken 5 minutes. But as Grace pushed through the heavy glass doors, the cold marble beneath her feet seemed to whisper a warning. The lobby stretched before her like a cathedral of wealth, golden chandeliers casting prismatic light across walls lined with portraits of long-dead bank presidents, all of them white, all of them male. She took her place in line behind a young businessman checking his Rolex, ahead of a woman in designer heels discussing her vacation home in the Hamptons. Grace clutched her worn purse tighter, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on her shoulders. She came here simply to withdraw what was hers, but today, dignity itself will be tested. The line moved with mechanical precision. Grace watched the tellers, young, polished, efficient, processing transactions with the smooth indifference of machines. When her turn finally arrived, she approached the marble counter with the careful steps of someone who had learned to navigate hostile territory. The nameplate read, Derek Martinez. And he couldn't have been older than 25, his hair styled with the confidence of someone who had never known uncertainty. Grace placed her worn passbook on the counter, her voice soft but clear. "Good morning. I'd like to withdraw $300 from my savings account, please." The words carried the accumulated politeness of decades, the careful diplomacy of someone who had learned that survival often depended on making others comfortable with your presence. Derek barely glanced up from his computer screen. His eyes, when they finally met hers, held the casual dismissal of someone looking through rather than at another human being. He picked up her passbook as if it might contaminate him, his manicured fingers holding at arm's length. "This account, you're sure this is yours?" The question dripped with skepticism, loud enough for the customers behind Grace to hear. "Yes, sir. I've had that account for 28 years. Grace's voice remained steady, but something flickered in her eyes, a shadow of memory from times when such questions carried different, more dangerous implications. Derek's laugh was sharp, designed to cut. 28 years? At First National. He gestured around the opulent lobby as if the marble itself should reject her presence. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right bank? Maybe you're thinking of the Community Credit Union down on Elm Street." His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never been made to feel small, amplified for the entertainment of witnesses. But humiliation has many stages, and she was only at the first. The businessman behind Grace shifted uncomfortably, his Rolex suddenly fascinating. The woman with the designer heels pulled out her phone, pretending to scroll while her eyes remained fixed on the unfolding drama. Derek seemed to feed off their attention, his voice growing bolder, more theatrical. "I mean, accounts like yours, they usually require significant minimum balances. Are you certain you haven't confused us with one of those more accessible institutions?" Grace's hand began to tremble, not from age, but from the familiar ache of being made invisible. She opened her purse with careful dignity, retrieving her driver's license, her Social Security card, even a faded photograph of her late husband in his Army uniform. "I have identification, sir. I've never missed a payment, never overdraft. I've been nothing but loyal to this bank." Derek examined each document with exaggerated scrutiny, holding them up to the light as if checking for forgeries. "These could be anyone's," he announced to his growing audience. "Identity theft is a serious problem, especially among certain populations." The pause before his final words hung in the air like poison gas. A mother quickly pulled her young daughter away from the counter, as if poverty were contagious. An elderly man in an expensive suit muttered something about standards slipping. Grace felt the walls of the lobby closing in, the golden chandeliers becoming spotlights, illuminating her humiliation for all to see. "Sir, please," Grace whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "I just need my own money. I have arthritis medication to buy, groceries." But her quiet desperation only seemed to encourage Derek's performance. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside while we verify this information. Security." His voice echoed through the marble chamber like a judge's gavel. "We may have a situation here." Two security guards approached, their faces masks of professional indifference. Grace's breath caught in her throat as memories flooded back. Other uniforms, other times when her very existence had been treated as a crime. She gripped her cane tighter, summoning every ounce of dignity she had left. The gathered customers formed an impromptu jury. Some whispered cruel speculations about welfare fraud and government assistance. Others simply stared, their silence a form of violence all its own. Derek basked in their attention, his chest puffed with the borrowed authority of his marble palace. And yet, among the whispers and laughter, one pair of eyes was not amused. In a corner booth near the floor-to-ceiling windows sat a man who seemed to occupy space differently than the others. Where they fidgeted and whispered, he remained perfectly still. His baseball cap cast shadows across features that might have been familiar under different circumstances. But his focus was absolute, unwavering. Each cruel word from Derek's mouth seemed to tighten something in his jaw, each laugh from the crowd darkening something in his eyes. He had chosen this corner table for its privacy, expecting to review some contracts in peace. Instead, he found himself witness to a scene that felt ripped from a history book, or perhaps a mirror reflecting the present more clearly than anyone wanted to admit. His massive frame remained coiled with the stillness of someone deciding whether to act or observe, but the decision was crystallizing with each passing moment of cruelty. Other customers bustled past his table without recognition. After all, who would expect to find Vin Diesel quietly reviewing paperwork in a suburban bank branch? His disguise wasn't elaborate, just a cap pulled low and the assumption that celebrities existed only on screens and red carpets. But behind those shadowed eyes, something was building like pressure in a closed system. He had spent his life playing heroes on screens, but today, the role would not be fiction. The security guards flanked Grace now, their presence turning her simple banking transaction into a public spectacle. Derek seemed intoxicated by his power, gesturing grandly as he explained to anyone within earshot how these people often tried to take advantage of premium institutions like First National. His voice carried the rehearsed authority of someone who had never been questioned, never been doubted, never been made to prove his right to exist in the spaces he occupied. Grace's shoulder began to sag under the weight of accumulated humiliation. 73 years of dignity, 5 decades of hard work, 3 decades of loyal banking relationship, all of it dissolving under the fluorescent judgment of strangers. She looked around the lobby one final time, searching for a single face that might reflect basic human decency, but found only averted eyes and cruel curiosity. Just as when the security guards reached for her arm, Vin Diesel rose. The movement was fluid but unmistakable, like a mountain deciding to relocate. He removed his baseball cap with deliberate slowness, his familiar features emerging from shadow like a developing photograph. The first gasp came from the woman with the designer heels, then another from the businessman. Then a ripple of recognition spread through the marble chamber like wildfire. Derek's voice died mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open as his brain struggled to process what his eyes were reporting. The security guards froze, their hands suddenly uncertain. Even Grace looked up through her tears, confusion replacing despair as she tried to understand why the entire bank had fallen silent. Vin Diesel stepped forward with a measured pace of someone accustomed to command, his presence seeming to alter the very atmosphere of the room. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the theatrical volume Derek had employed. Instead, it resonated with the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. "Before you escort this lady out," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade through silk, "maybe you should take a moment to understand exactly who you're speaking to." Derek's face cycled through expressions: confusion, recognition, terror, like a slot machine settling on bankruptcy. The crowd of customers pressed closer, phones emerging from pockets and purses as the impossible became undeniable. Grace stared up at the stranger who had materialized like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to speak. Vin turned his attention to Grace, his voice softening with genuine warmth. "Ma'am, how long did you say you've been banking here?" 28 years, Grace replied, her voice gaining strength from his calm presence. 28 years of loyalty, Vin repeated, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd before settling on Derek like a targeting system locking onto its mark. 28 years of trust. 28 years of giving this institution her business, her faith, her hard-earned money. His voice began to rise, not with theatricality, but with the controlled power of someone whose anger had been forged in deeper fires. "And in return," he continued, "you've made a spectacle of her. You've questioned her integrity, mocked her appearance, and treated her like a criminal in front of strangers." Derek tried to speak, but Vin's raised hand commanded silence. "You've done all of this to a woman who has contributed more to society in her 73 years than you've contributed in your 25. The lobby had become a courtroom, with Vin serving as both prosecutor and judge. His words carried the weight of someone who understood what it meant to fight for respect, to earn credibility through action rather than inheritance. You see an elderly black woman with a worn purse and assume she doesn't belong. But let me tell you what I see." He gestured toward Grace with a reverence reserved for monuments. "I see someone who worked multiple jobs to feed her family. Someone who saved every penny she could spare, not for luxury but for survival. Someone who chose to trust this bank with her life savings because she believed in the promise of dignity and fair treatment." His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the marble chamber. "And you repaid that trust with humiliation." Derek's face had gone pale, beads of sweat forming along his hairline, despite the bank's aggressive air conditioning. The security guard stepped back without being asked, subtly unsure of their role in this reverse power dynamic. The crowd of customers now watched with a horrified fascination of people witnessing a public execution. "Sir, I didn't know," Derek began, but Vin cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. "You didn't know what? That she was a human being deserving of basic respect? That her money was as real as anyone else's? Or did you mean you didn't know I was watching?" The questions hung in the air like accusations waiting for a verdict. Grace found her voice again, strengthened by this unexpected champion. "All I wanted was my own money. Money I earned cleaning hospital floors at 3 a.m. Money I saved by walking instead of taking buses, by mending clothes instead of buying new ones. It's not much, but it's mine." Vin nodded, his respect for her evident in every gesture. "And you shouldn't have to prove your worth to access what belongs to you." He turned back to Derek, whose arrogance had crumbled into pathetic desperation. "You just tried to humiliate a woman who could be my mother in front of me." The bank manager appeared as if summoned by the collective intake of breath from his lobby full of customers. His expensive suit couldn't hide the panic in his eyes as he took in the scene, his employee cowering before one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood, while cameras captured every moment for immediate upload to social media. This was a kind of viral disaster that ended careers and closed branches. "Mr. Diesel," he exclaimed, his voice cracking with desperation. "I am so sorry. There's been a terrible misunderstanding." Derek apologized immediately. But the damage was already done, broadcast live to the court of public opinion through a dozen phone screens. Derek stammered through what might generously have been called an apology, his words tumbling over each other in their haste to escape his mouth. But Vin wasn't interested in hollow gestures performed under duress. "Don't apologize to me," he said firmly. "Apologize to Mrs. Washington. Loudly, publicly, so everyone who witnessed your cruelty can witness your accountability." The teller turned to Grace, his earlier arrogance replaced by trembling humility. "Mrs. Washington, I'm deeply sorry. I was wrong, completely wrong. Please forgive me." His voice cracked on the final words, understanding perhaps for the first time in his privileged life what it felt like to be powerless. But for Grace, the real victory was yet to come. As the crowd began to disperse and the manager ushered Derek away for what would certainly be a career-ending conversation, Vin gently guided Grace to a quiet corner of the lobby, away from the cameras and whispers. He pulled out a chair for her and sat down across the small table, his enormous frame folding with surprising grace. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but would you tell me a bit about yourself? About your life?" His question carried genuine curiosity, the interest of someone who understood that every person contained multitudes of untold stories. Grace's eyes misted as she began to speak. She told him about her late husband, James, a Korean War veteran who had worked construction until his back gave out, about raising 4 children on a seamstress's wages after James passed, about working 3 jobs, hospital cleaning, alterations, and weekend babysitting, to keep food on the table and dreams alive in young hearts. "I saved every penny I could," she explained, her voice growing stronger with each memory. "Not for fancy things, but for security, so my children could go to college, so I could retire with dignity, so I would never be a burden on anyone." She paused, looking around the opulent lobby. "I chose this bank because it felt stable, permanent. I thought if I was loyal to them, they would be loyal to me." Vin listened with the complete attention of someone who understood the weight of every word. His fame and fortune suddenly felt insignificant compared to the quiet heroism of this woman's daily existence. "Mrs. Washington," he said finally, "what you've accomplished, raising a family, building a life, maintaining your dignity through decades of struggle, that's real strength. That's real success." Grace smiled through her tears. "Mr. Diesel, I don't know how to thank you. You didn't have to speak up. You could have just watched like everyone else." Her voice carried decades of accumulated gratitude for small kindnesses in a world that often offered none. "Ma'am," Vin replied, his voice heavy with conviction, "I only did what any decent person should do, what everyone in that lobby should have done." He paused, his gaze returning to the spot where she had been humiliated. "My mother raised me to understand that we're all connected, that when someone is treated with cruelty, it diminishes all of us. And when someone stands up for what's right, it elevates all of us." As they spoke, Grace's transaction was finally completed, with profound apologies, waived fees, and promises of improved staff training that would likely be forgotten within a month. But the numbers on her withdrawal slip weren't what mattered anymore. What mattered was the restoration of something that couldn't be deposited or withdrawn, her dignity. The afternoon sun streamed to the bank's windows, casting new shadows across the same marble that had witnessed her humiliation. But Grace Washington walked differently now, her cane tapping out a rhythm of quiet triumph. The money in her purse would buy her medications and groceries, just as she had planned. But she carried something more valuable, the knowledge that she had been seen, truly seen, by someone who chose to act rather than merely observe. As Vin watched her leave, he reflected on a truth that fame had taught him. The camera eventually stops rolling, the applause eventually fades, but the moments when we choose our humanity over our comfort, those moments echo forever. He had played heroes on screen for decades, but today he had learned something profound about the role from a 73-year-old woman who had been living it every day of her life. Banks measure wealth in numbers, but real wealth is dignity. Humiliation is a weapon of the weak, wielded by those who mistake cruelty for strength. But respect, true respect, is a shield of the strong, offered freely to those who understand that every person carries the weight of their own struggles, their own dreams, their own quiet heroism. In a world that often turns away when the vulnerable are humiliated, change begins when even one voice refuses to remain silent. When one person decides that another person's dignity matters more than their own comfort. When someone chooses to see the human being behind the assumptions, the individual behind the stereotypes, the story behind the surface. Grace Washington returned to First National Bank the following week to close her account. She transferred her savings to a community credit union, where the tellers knew her name and the manager remembered her late husband's service in Korea. Derek Martinez was terminated within 48 hours of the incident, his humiliation now preserved forever in viral videos titled, "Bank Employee Gets Destroyed by Vin Diesel for Disrespecting Elderly Woman." But the real story wasn't about revenge or viral fame. It was about a moment when human decency overcame institutional indifference, when someone with power chose to use it for someone without it, when dignity was restored not through violence or vengeance, but through the simple act of bearing witness and refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. Tell me in the comments below, where are you watching from? And have you ever witnessed someone stand up for what's right when it would have been easy to look away? Because true power isn't measured in dollars or fame, but in our willingness to protect those who have none. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about courage, justice, and the moments that define who we really are. Because true power is not in money, not in fame, but in protecting those who have none.